Hello everybody. Today we're going to be discussing literature reviews, and I want to give a special thank you and shout out to Dr. Stanislaw and Dr. Potter for sharing some of their slides with me. So let's discuss literature reviews. What is a literature review? Well, a literature review is made up of a bunch of article reviews. So it's basically looking at all of the literature in a certain field or a certain topic or a certain scenario and putting it together to tell a story or create an argument that you'd like to make. If we are interested in a field of study and we start to develop a research question, we then want to go to the literature to determine what is out there. When we go and we read other articles on the topic, we can find inspiration, we can avoid duplication, and we can feed off of other things that have already been done. So remember, science is cumulative. We use the literature review to create the foundation, the scope, and or the background, the argument for the research that we're doing. And I love this quote by Sir Isaac Newton, but if I see further, it is because I stand on the shoulders of giants. And that is just a huge shout out to people who have done work before us and that they were so kind to share that work with us so that we could continue to grow in all fields of science. So literature reviews, the very most simplistic thing to remember is they tell us what has already been done and what is already known, and they let us figure out what needs to become knowledge. So we can determine what is already known and what we need to know. Let's start off with breaking it down just one article at a time. When you sit down to read an article, a journal article, a peer-reviewed journal article, and on my slide it says an APA paper, but actually it's just a scientific paper. It could be written in another format. But when you sit down to read a peer-reviewed journal article, you do not want to read it like a novel or a book or a story. You don't want to start at the first sentence and just read all the way through. That is just very painful. You want to read it a lot more like a newspaper. For me personally, I figured out my niche of what part drew me in the first. And it's going to be a little different for all of you. Same thing with the newspaper. Some people go straight to the sales. Some people go straight to the sports section. Some go straight to the comics. Some go straight to the frontline news. And to be quite honest, I'm pretty sure almost no one goes to a newspaper at all anymore. However, think of a magazine maybe, or a blog. You don't always start at the beginning and go forward. We tend to go to what gravitates or what grabs us the most, where we gravitate the most, and then we bounce around and we continue to find things that just sort of become interesting after what we've already read. So you want to first, of course, read the title to identify if it is a good paper and in your wheelhouse of what you're looking for. Oftentimes, the good titles will mention the independent variables and the dependent variables, so this will let you know exactly what it is that you'll be reading about. Then you want to read the abstract to make sure that the paper's good and appropriate for you. After that, I usually go straight to the method section. I want to see what they've done, and I kind of wait. I know I want to know what the results are, but I like to wait and see how they did things, and then I'll jump to the results. And a lot of times after the results, I'll go back to the introduction and look through some of their literature and see what they were saying and see did they answer the questions they were originally wanted to ask. And I'll end with the conclusion or discussion. I kind of bounce around where it makes sense to me, and you're going to find your niche. But I do suggest that you don't just try to read it from start to finish. Now, when you are reading an article, you want to be sure to know whether or not the author is discussing a primary source or a secondary source. just as important is when you're writing your papers, you want to be very distinctive and clear on whether or not you are citing a primary source or citing a secondary source. It is always better to cite a primary source. A primary source is when they are writing and they're talking about I or we. This is typically what you're going to find in a peer-reviewed or scientific journal article. A secondary source or secondary authors describe research conducted by someone else. So they're talking about what they did or he or she did. In a literature review section, this is when you're reading someone else's literature review section and they're discussing what other researchers have done before. This is not always the area that is the best for you to get information from for your research. When you're reading someone else's literature review session, you want to go and find those articles that they're talking about if you're interested in them. Another time that you will hear a lot of secondary sources is when somebody is doing a meta-analysis, which is when they take several different research studies and do a study to see how similar or different those studies are. In the field of psychology, we definitely write most of our papers in APA format, which stands for the American Psychological Association, and this is the format. Just this in the late winter time of 2019 going on 2020, the APA manual switched from the 6th edition to the 7th edition. This will tell you how to cite references both in the text, whether it's in parenthetical information or whether it's in the sentences. It tells you how to put your references in the proper format and order in the reference section. It gives all sorts of information on how to write professionally in the field of psychology, your scientific work. It helps with how to format tables and graphs and figures. Just tons and tons of information. So this is a really good book when you start to write. When you are writing a literature review, what needs to be cited? This is a really tough question for some people. But keep in mind, if you get any information from someone else where you are you're using their ideas, you're quoting them, you're describing what they said or did, you're going to want to cite them. Chapter 6 of the publication manual, actually that might have changed. I think it was chapter 6 in APA 6. I'm not quite sure, sorry, but there is a chapter in the publication manual that will help you with this on what needs to be cited. You want to cite any studies that you've discussed in the literature review. If you're talking about someone's study, you want to let the reader be aware of who had done the study. If you're discussing any theories, study designs, or ideas that were suggested by others, you want to give them credit. Definitely any direct or exact quotes, any definitions, where did they come from, and if there's material sources, such as if you used a questionnaire that had already been used before, this is something that you would want to cite. The citation can either be, as I said earlier, in the text, or it can be in parenthetical quotes at the end of a sentence. So let's read these. The first one is, Hibbert, 2006, found that grades increased after students provided their instructors with chocolate. The next one where we see is, bribing instructors with chocolate was found to be significant. Hibbert, 2007. So that one's at the end of the sentence. That's called a parenthetical citation. The one above, the first one, is an in-text citation. Remember that you will be writing a literature review. You will be gathering many, many articles. You will be using each article. You are going to discuss what you found in that article, and you're going to combine each article review to make a literature review. So when you're writing these, you want to summarize each study in the same order as an APA paper. So you want to cite an article in the same order, which I will show you in a few minutes. But you want to look at the intro section, the method section, the results section, the discussion or limitations. You don't want to summarize introduction lit reviews. You don't want to summarize what the other paper that you're reading, what their literature review is. You just want to summarize and discuss the variables in the study itself. You want to briefly discuss the methods that they used. In doing so, you might want to include like the county or the state or dates or something that's specific, maybe time or location specific. You'd want to summarize the results, but you don't report the statistics. It's a summary. And you want to summarize the critical points from the discussion. You only want to include things that are important to your study, not necessarily important to their study, but things that matter to your study. So remember, you do not want to summarize somebody else's introduction or literature review section, but you do want to summarize their methods, their results, and their discussion. So let's look at a few examples. Here's an example of one article review. Jonah, 1984, used a survey to study self-reported seatbelt use and attitudes towards seatbelts in Canada. Seatbelt use was higher where laws required use. Attitudes towards seatbelts predicted actual seatbelt use and were more positive where seatbelt use was required. Pressure from friends and family also predicted seatbelt use. The results suggest that laws requiring seatbelts should be coupled with campaigns to improve attitudes towards seatbelts. So you'll notice that first, the very first thing we discussed was sort of what we read in the introduction of the paper. Basically, what this paper was about. Who did it? What did they do? So Jonah studied self-reported seatbelt use and attitudes towards seatbelts. Then we want to talk about their method. How did they do this? Well, they used a survey. And where were they? They were in Canada. The next thing you want to know is that the results that they found in the study. So the study from Jonah's study found that seatbelt use was higher where laws required use, that attitudes towards seatbelts predicted actual seatbelt use, and were more positive where seatbelt use was required. Pressure from friends and family also predicted seatbelt use. So these are the results they found. And the discussion. The results suggest that laws requiring seatbelt use should be coupled with campaigns to improve attitudes towards seatbelts. So this paragraph here is one paragraph that discusses who did it, what did they do, how did they do it, what did they find. And this is what you want to do over and over again for each of the articles that you've written. You want to write who did it, what did they do, how did they do it, and what did they find. And you want to put a bunch of those together, and that will create your literature review. Some other articles that you might come across when you're doing a literature review is one could be a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is something that I stated a little bit earlier. They're going to look at a bunch of different articles, and then they're going to analyze those articles. So instead of watching 100 people to see what they do and analyzing what 100 people do, this is actually a bunch of different people did research, and I'm going to look at all the research that's been done and analyze that. So Caird et al. Conducted a meta-analysis of 33 studies that examined the effects of cell phone use on driving performance. Handheld and hands-free phones both increased reaction times by 0.25 seconds. These findings suggest that any form of cell phone use while driving is dangerous. So you will notice that, again, we have who did it, what did they do. They conducted a meta-analysis of 33 studies. They were looking at the cell phones and performance. And what did they find? What were their results? That handheld and hands-free phones both increased reaction times by 0.25 seconds. So still writing it up in the same format, even though it's a meta-analysis. You also might come across something that's using archival data or an archival study, and this is when somebody goes back and you're not looking at human subjects, but you're going back over old records that already exist. Williams and Shabanova study the age and sex of drivers who were at fault in fatal crashes in the United States. Drivers in the youngest and oldest age groups were more likely to cause a fatal crash than middle-aged drivers. Males tended to cause more fatal crashes than females among young drivers, while females tended to cause more fatal crashes than males among older drivers. So we see again who did it and what did they do. Well, they looked at age and sex of drivers and who were at fault in the fatal crashes. What did they find? They found that drivers in the youngest and oldest age groups were more likely to cause fatal crashes, so on. They break it down by males and females. So this is just a quick rundown of how you can give a review of an entire article in one paragraph, and you can end up putting these paragraphs together to create a literature review. I hope that helps, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks. Bye-bye.